British music on a Wednesday evening, and time for our classic album of the day, which is Soul Mining by theyre. And to talk us through it as well, I'm very pleased to say, to talk about the record, making the record and the impact of the record, Matt Johnson is here. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much.
Just before we get to the actual album, take us back to the old Matt Johnson, or the young Matt Johnson. What did the young Matt Johnson listen to when you were in your early teens?
He had lots of lovely, long, blonde, curly hair.
Right.
And in those days, what was I listening to? It was an interesting time in British music in the late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah.
I wasn't a fan of punk, but the post-punk era was very interesting to me. You know, the Cabaret Voltaire, Throbbing Gristle.
Because that's the thing that's interesting, is how people's how punk and its fallout affected people. Because it affected people's tastes in different ways, didn't it?
Yeah. Well, my older brother, Andrew, was heavily into punk. He saw the Sex Pistols at their infamous gig at the 100 Club.
Did he?
Yeah. And he used to bring back a lot of records. And the British punk I wasn't such a fan of, but he brought back a lot of the interesting stuff from interesting American bands, like Television, Talking Heads, Patti Smith.
Yeah.
So punk itself, I think it was the punk attitude and ethos that anybody can do it. Because prior to that, it had been very sort of, with a lot of progressive bands, it had been very muso-led. And for a young guy that's sort of self-taught musician such as myself, that was kind of slightly intimidating to feel that you had to read and write music so proficiently. And so all of a sudden, with the punk explosion, there was this real sense of anybody can do it. Unfortunately, with punk, they all copied each other, so it sounded very much the same. But the post-punk bands were all very, very different and unique. And of course, over that sort of 4 or 5 year period, you had all sorts of interesting movements coming from different parts of Britain.
And you were living, in London at the time? You were living in town or in the suburbs? Or?
I would have been probably... in soul mining, I was living in London, but prior to that, probably Burning Blue Soul, I would have been living at my parents' pub in Essex at that point.
Right.
A place called Loughton.
Oh, yes, where I started my career.
Was it?
On the West Essex Gazette as a junior reporter.
West Essex Gazette. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. I didn't spend much time in Loughton, or as little time as I possibly could, so I was on the Central Line all the time into Tottenham Court Road. And of course at that time I worked in a studio in Soho, DeWolf studio, from the age of 15. So I was around the West End a lot.
And so when did you decide that you wanted to make music and to do it properly?
About the age of 4 or 5. Because I grew up in quite a famous East London pub called the Two Puddings, and my uncle Kenny was one of London's, one of Britain's top music promoters in the 50s and 60s. So he promoted the Who, the Kinks, John Lee Hooker. He promoted pretty much everyone apart from the Beatles, I think. So in the dance hall on the first floor of the pub, there was a lot of music all the time going on there. So it was very much a big part of my life from being a baby, I suppose, really. So it was a big part, and I was doing gigs by the age of 11. I had a little band called
this is the other thing, isn't it? Because, I mean, although, people describe Soul Mining as the debut record, you'd been making records. You'd made a lot of records already, hadn't you? You made a couple of albums which never saw the light of day.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. So I was, by the time of Soul Mining, how old was I? About 21. I was a 10-year veteran in a way, doing gigs and working in a studio and putting out records. So I think that's why people felt that it was old head on young shoulders in a way. It sort of a debut, a major Labour debut, but it was actually quite a long time coming.
Yeah, it takes a while to get there. I suppose we should mention as well, one of the things you were saying about the fallout of punk and the DIY ethos, one of the great things was all the labels. And so obviously a lot of those labels, which became, very influential at the time, were after you from quite early doors, weren't they? Some Bizarre, which was a classic label. You were on their first compilation album, I think.
4AD.
And then 4AD. Yeah. It's an interesting point, because this is, there's the launch of people like, there's the Mute label as well, which eventually gives you Depeche Mode. You can see already Human League developing from Travelogue into what will become theyre, and it's all this stuff, and into this landscape, your first proper record, Burning Blue Soul, and even given, the experiments of the time, it's a very versatile but sometimes confusing record, I would say.
Well, I was, how old was I at the time? 17, 18 or whatever, so teenager. I think the thing was, because I was working in recording studios, I was learning a lot about tape manipulation. I was quite inspired by very experimental music, I suppose. Likes of the Residents, and as I mentioned, krautrock and suddenly learning all these techniques. I mean, nowadays, of course, musicians have access to samplers, but then you had to do it with the old tape recorders, slowing things down, chopping the tape up, making loops. I had a little private room at the DeWolf Studios in Soho as a teenager, and
how big is it, this room? Paint the picture.
It's small. It's a small room. And
is it more like a cupboard?
A bit bigger than a cupboard. I'd say it's a quarter of the size of this room.
Right.
And I was supposed to be obviously working on the company stuff, but I would sneak up into the room and just do my own stuff. So
what sort of things would you been doing?
Oh, the tape loops. So I would get hold of unusual percussion tracks. I would record sounds off of radios or shortwave radios, and I would make up these loops and then re-record them, slow them down, reverse them. And I was building up all the backing tracks for the early the live performances, as well as obviously what then became Burning Blue Soul, or the album before Burning Blue Soul as well, Spirit. So.
Did they ever notice you weren't doing their work?
I had 2 or 3 official warnings, so I ended up leaving before I got the sack, but they were very forgiving, ultimately.
There are things, though, there are times on the record, though, where you can see that almost, I don't know if you describe it as a blueprint, but like a sun rising through my garden, there's a nod to where you were going to end up with the next record.
Yeah, that's quite a melodic track, as I remember. Actually, not a long time since I've heard this record, actually. I'll have to listen to it. Yeah. And I think the most accomplished song in terms of emotional content would have been Another Boy Drowning. That was the first song that I wrote lyrically when I actually started crying as I was writing it, because I felt that I'd somehow sort of connected for the first time with what I was feeling inside my heart with what I was writing through my hand. And that really signposted to me where I wanted to go as a songwriter, with songs with the strong emotional content to move people, although obviously production-wise, there's a lot on that album that then I was to take forward and work on with the future albums.
Doesn't happen straight away, though. Isn't there another album, another unreleased album, I think, and then
Pornography of Despair.
Pornography of Despair, but then what happens next? I mean, by this point, you go and make some demos, don't you? Or you go and do some recordings in New York. Actually, is that the next step?
That's right. Sent over there by London Records.
Right.
And my manager at the time, a chap called Steve-O, managed to get them to pay for the trip to New York, recording these songs with Mike Thorne at Advision Studios, but without signing any contract. So the recordings came out very well, and he hawked them around various other record companies, and CBS outbid London Records, and I went to them, much to London's fury.
Yeah.
They weren't very happy, but
no, I can
understandable.
Yeah, I can imagine. And this is sort of where I suppose there is becoming maybe a more cohesive thing in your head. It's becoming clearer what it is that you want to do next.
I think the plan at the start, in a way, was almost more of a concept group. To be able to change the lineup all the time, to keep it fluid, because I always wanted each album to sound quite distinct, rather than have a settled band sound. A lot of bands, they just sound like who they are, which may be a good thing. But I prefer to change and evolve and stretch myself. That sometimes results in less record sales, because a lot of the fans like that. At this stage, it was more developing my songwriting abilities, I think, and focusing on that. So Uncertain Smile, the recording that I initially did in New York, it was probably the most commercial thing that I'd done up to that point, probably even since, actually, thinking about it.
Great timing, though, with CBS and their checkbook hanging about.
That was like, for me, as a young kid, like signing for Manchester United.
The next part of the story is the making of the record. We'll get to that after the track, which starts Soul Mining. This is I've Been Waiting for Tomorrow. All mining, and that's I've been waiting for tomorrow all my life. It's theyre, our classic album of the day to day, and Matt Johnson is our guide through the record. I mean, it's a perfect start to this record, in that it seems to set the scene, I suppose, of what we're going to get.
Yeah, it was very. That's the most aggressive track. And Waiting for Tomorrow features the drumming of my old friend Zeke Manyika, who at the time was also in Orange Juice, of course. There's a lot of anger, a lot of impatience, and for some reason, although I was very young, I was sort of 19 or 20, I was, being aware of I suppose, propaganda and awareness that things aren't all they seem.
Well, it was a strangely sort of paranoid time, though, wasn't it? I think if you go back to, you know, I suppose in writing this record in '82, it comes in '83. So around the '82, '83 era, you've got the Falklands War, the Cold War, the campaign for nuclear disarmament, the struggle against apartheid. You have all these major issues at play. Yeah. With, I say, this sort of almost this landscape, this slightly paranoid, slightly scared, spooked landscape. You're where? Because you write this album. You write the album at home in a little flat somewhere, or you write it in the studio?
It was over a few years. Like, some of the songs are a bit older, so some were in bedroom, mainly in bedrooms. Me lying on the floor with my pencils and paper, probably.
Because that's one of the things that, going back and listening to it, I didn't remember it being as claustrophobic at times as it sounds. It really feels like it's written in a room. You can feel being inside four walls. So you know the outside is outside, but actually there's a lot of you from the inside.
Yeah, particularly, songs like Twilight Hour, of course, which is very, very claustrophobic, and that, again, is a story of a relationship and the power struggle within the relationship, and the insecurities rise to the surface during the course of that song. Other songs like, Soul Mining itself, the title track, again, is quite emotionally paranoid, I suppose. Yeah. It's hard for me, I don't listen to my own stuff very often, to be honest, these days, so it's hard for me to put myself back in that frame of mind. I'm a lot happier as a person now.
I should hope so, because the person in this record,
This Is the Day is a hopeful song. It's quite a happy song.
Well, that's the thing, because at that point you think, having contextualised the album, you open the album and it's quite a vicious sounding opening, and it's trying to, it's like a wake up call to do something, right, to sort things out, to get a grip, and then you think, this is the day. Yeah, this is good. Yeah. Oh, I see. Right, we're going on a trip. But then after that, it's just, man, you're bombarded with your own anxieties.
Yeah, and the sinking feeling. I mean, that really was, particularly the chorus of that really summed up what was then later to become known as Generation X, I suppose, or, the Beaten generation, as I mentioned it myself. Symptom, what is it? I'm just a symptom of the moral decay,
which is gnawing at the
heart of the country. So that really summed up, I think, where we were at that point. What did we have? Unemployment at 3.5 million. I was also signing on the dole myself for a couple of years, so I was certainly experiencing what I was writing about.
Yeah. If it was written in, on various bedroom floors, it was made at John Fox's studios.
Yeah, which I later bought, actually. It was the Garden Studios. Right. Big, comfortable room, underground. It was in Shoreditch. It was in a basement. In those days, it was genuinely edgy, because no one was around. It was very dark, underlit, and industrial buildings.
Yeah, this is the atmosphere of the time, though, isn't it? As you say, it's slightly dark.
Yeah,
it's giving the whole record atmosphere.
Yeah. It was a lovely atmosphere in that studio. It was very, being a basement, you lost all sense of time. I wanted to go for a combination of acoustic instruments with a certain amount of electronic. Live drums wherever possible. We used things like accordions, marimbas, violins and cellos, pianos, and I sneakily borrowed John Fox's Juno 60, I think it was, because John would say, now, guys, you can use anything in the studio that you want, but don't use my Juno 60. I've only just bought it, and he locked it away in the cupboard. Right. And of course, after a few weeks, we got, the temptation was too great, so we broke in, got his Juno 60 out and started using that all over the album. And one night he came home, came in unexpected, and course, he just raised a quizzical eyebrow and let's get on with it. But so it's a very a warm sounding record, because also being done obviously on tape, as everything was in those days.
It's interesting as well, just the list of instrumentation which you give. I think it's the early signs of you wanting to do something cinematic as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that also ties in to when I was a kid. I think the only records we had the Beatles' White Album, and then we had a few film soundtracks like Lawrence of Arabia by Maurice Jarre and a few other ones. And also working for DeWolf, which specialised in film soundtracks. So it's something that I loved. And as a kid, you probably remember some of those amazing film themes, The Prisoner, for instance, The Avengers. There was fantastic film and television themes. And that's something that I love from an early age, so that was a natural thing for me to work towards. But I did try to make the album sounding quite cinematic, particularly the closing track, Giant, which is a very cinematic track.
Yeah, very much is. What was the highs and the lows of the record? The track that was most difficult to do, and the track which you thought, actually, this has come alive in a way which even I probably hadn't seen. This is my success. I can walk away from this thinking this is good.
I think Uncertain Smile was a tricky one initially because, as we mentioned earlier, I'd already recorded one version of that in New York with Mike Thorne. Which was successful as a club record. So revisiting that was sort of tricky, and I wasn't happy with that until we got the piano solo at the end. And of course, that was quite fortuitous, really, because Jools Holland is not somebody that I knew personally, and he was suggested by Annie Rosebery, my A&R lady at CBS, and Jools came down one afternoon because we had this long outro. We were thinking, how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to feel this?
Always a problem for bands. How does this one finish?
Exactly.
How do we end it?
Exactly. And we happened to have a beautiful little Yamaha, I think it was a C5 mini grand piano in this lovely live room. So we thought, well, it's got to be piano. And Jules came down dressed in his leathers on a hot summer's day and performed this track in its first take, apart from one drop in, but first take. And at the time, Paul Hardin and myself looked at each other as Jules was playing it and just gave each other a nod, like, we've got it, we've had it, because that track was causing us problems until the piano solo.
Does Jools Holland get a standing ovation at the end when he finishes and the tape switched off? Well done. Well done, that man.
We were very, very happy. Very, very happy. Other tracks that were tricky, I think probably Giant initially, because some of the songs I was writing in the studio, and those tracks really evolved throughout the process of recording, so it was putting something down and then really just experimenting in the studio. What do we need here? Let's try this, try this, try this. And the chanting thing came towards the end. With Giant, that's what really brought that to life.
Yeah, very much.
So that was that in a way, and I chose that as the closing track on the album because, again, it's, although lyrically you could say it's a sort of existential anxiety that's being expressed, but it's musically it's a very uplifting song. And I think there was always that dichotomy, really, and in a lot of my stuff I was trying to express the positive emotions musically, but probably lyrically giving the, I didn't want things to sound too saccharine, so I would then add the little sort of twist of melancholy, but musically I tried to make things as uplifting as possible, and I think in that track it's a very, very warm and uplifting track, which is what we intended to do.
It wraps up our Six Music Classic album of the day, which went to number 3 in Melody Maker's albums of the year. We'll play one more track from it in a second. We should mention though as well, having said, there was obviously going to be some further work to be done in the filmic arena. Yeah, you're doing something along those lines now, aren't you? You've got a record label?
Yeah, that's right. Cineola, which is what I would call an independent film soundtrack company, and we've just released our 3rd album. It was released on CD, but we've just collaborated with Death Waltz Records, and we've released a beautiful double album vinyl, and that's just come out a couple of weeks ago. And I'm actually doing an event that's on September the 28th, and there'll be an overview of the Cineola project, and we'll be playing vinyl and discussing those soundtracks.
Oh, that's a lovely way to spend an afternoon. And this has been a lovely way to spend an evening. Thank you so much for coming in, Mats. And here is another track from our featured album today, from Soul Mining. We'll play. Let's go back to The Sinking Feeling. It's the on Six Music. It's where I started my career.
Was it?
On the West Essex Gazette as a junior reporter.
West Essex Gazette. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. I didn't spend much time in Loughton, or as little time as I possibly could, so I was on the Central Line all the time, into Tottenham Court Road. And of course at that time I worked in a studio in Soho, De Wolf studio, from the age of 15, so I was around the West End a lot.
And so when did you decide that you wanted to make music and to do it properly?
About the age of 4 or 5. And the British punk I wasn't such a fan of, but he brought back a lot of the interesting stuff from interesting American bands like Television, Talking Heads, Patti Smith.
Yeah.
So punk itself, I think it was the punk attitude and ethos that anybody can do it, because prior to that it had been very sort of, with a lot of progressive bands, it had been very muso led, and for a young guy that's sort of self-taught musicians such as myself, that was kind of slightly intimidating to feel that you had to read and write music so proficiently. And so all of a sudden, with the punk explosion,
it's music on a Wednesday evening, and time for our classic album of the day, which is Soul Mining by theyre. And to talk us through it as well, I'm very pleased to say, to talk about the record, making the record and the impact of the record, Matt Johnson is here. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much.
Just before we get to the actual album, take us back to the old Matt Johnson, or the young Matt Johnson. What did the young Matt Johnson listen to when you were in your early teens?
He had lots of lovely, long, blonde, curly hair.
Right.
And in those days, what was I listening to? It was an interesting time in British music in the late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah.
I wasn't a fan of punk, but the post-punk era was very interesting to me. The Cabaret Voltaire, Throbbing Gristle.
Because that's the thing that's interesting, is how people's how punk and its fallout affected people. Because it affected people's tastes in different ways, didn't it?
Yeah. Well, my older brother, Andrew, was heavily into punk. He saw the Sex Pistols at their infamous gig at the 100 Club.
Did he?
Yeah. And he used to bring back a lot of records. There was this real sense of anybody can do it. Unfortunately, with punk, they all copied each other, so it sounded very much the same. But the post-punk bands were all very, very different and unique. And, of course, over that sort of 4 or 5 year period, you had all sorts of interesting movements coming from different parts of Britain.
And you were living, in London at the time? You were living in town or in the suburbs? Or?
I would have been probably... in soul mining, I was living in London, but prior to that, probably Burning Blue Soul, I would have been living at my parents' pub in Essex at that point.
Right.
A place called Loughton.
Oh, yeah.